I'm Veronica Chambers, Narrative Projects Editor at the New York Times, and welcome to OffStage, our series exploring theater making during this unprecedented time. Tonight, we're going to dive in on the new musical Suffragist, which tells the stories of some of the women who fought to achieve voting equality in this country in the years leading up to the passage of the 19th Amendment and the struggles they fought along the way. We'll have conversations with both the cast and the creative team tonight, and also share 2 songs with you. A quick housekeeping note, you may submit questions anytime during the event using the Q&A feature in Zoom. Please also note this event is being recorded. Let's get started. I'm joined by 3 members of the creative team from Suffragist: Shaina Taub, the author. Hi, Shaina. Leigh Silverman, the director.
Hi.
Hi. And Mimi Lien, the scenic designer. Welcome to all of you.
Hi, thanks.
We're so excited to be talking to you. The show is meant to start performances this fall at the Public Theater. And of course, now it's on pause like all live theater, but you've been working on it for a number of years. Shaina, what first inspired you to create this show? How did it begin?
Well, my suffrage obsession began about 6 years ago when Rachel Sussman, who's one of our amazing lead producers, sat me down and said, "What do you know about the women's suffrage movement?" And I was like, Susan B. Anthony, a convention in upstate New York, 1800s, you know, that sort of one anecdote we all get fed in high school, the one that they've chosen that we can get. And, but I said, really nothing else. I was sort of embarrassed. And she said, well, I think you should write a musical about it. And here's this book called Jailed for Freedom. And Jailed for Freedom is written by Doris Stevens. For those who don't know, she was a suffragist, member of the National Women's Party, and it's her first person account that chronicles, you know, kind of like the last run of years leading up to the passage of the 19th Amendment. And I basically stayed up all night that night. She gave it to me reading it like a suspense thriller. I just thought it was so riveting. I mean, the crazy thing is I knew the 19th Amendment passed, but I just had no clue about how dramatic and explosive it was, and the hunger strikes and the picketing the White House and going to prison. I was just at the edge of my seat and just so blown away, and by how theatrical the movement was too, with all the pageantry they had, and then that sort of exhilaration turned to shock and alarm that I hadn't learned this in school, and that, you know, this story, this huge chapter in the history of civil rights and voting rights in this country had not made it to me until my mid-20s. And I feel like I'd been sort of uniquely looking for a story to tell about a group of complicated girls trying to take on the system, and that was sort of in my backyard this whole time. And, you know, I knew right away that I wanted to be a musical because I grew up learning about history through musicals. You know, I learned about Nazis in World War II through cabaret, and doing cabaret in high school. And I feel like musicals are these incredible communal projects where we all grow up in our schools and communities embodying these stories. And so my sort of dream is that to create a piece that a new generation of girls would grow up embodying these women as, you know, full flesh and blood human beings.
I love that. I'm also wearing my Jailed for Freedom pin. So I love that book. Mimi and Leigh, when did you enter the process, and what has your creative journey been like with this show?
Shaina and I started talking about it about 3.5 or 4 years ago, right, Shaina? Yeah. I was a crazed super fan of Shaina's, had seen her perform a number of times, and thought she was just the most extraordinary songwriter. And she was telling me about this musical that she was working on. Rachel Sussman also told me about Shaina, brought me to Shaina's show, and that was really the beginning of our time together working on the show, on the material. Shaina's been writing all of it, the book, music, and lyrics, and we've been deep in the process of figuring out how to bring this story to life theatrically, to make it a show that feels exciting and relevant and irresistible and surprising and not a history lesson, and that brings the struggle of these women, what they accomplished, their fierceness, to the forefront, but that is truly at its heart a story about complicated women who made a lot of mistakes, but who centered equality and the fight for the right to vote in the way that they thought was best at that time, and really began, I think, for Shaina and I, with trying to figure out who these women were, and then how to bring them to the stage. And Mimi and I have worked together before. She's an unbelievably brilliant thinker, and we've been working now for about 1.5 years on a design for the show that will, I think, feel like a kind of unexpected and interesting way to present the material.
So Mimi, how did you get involved in the process, and what are some of the spaces that you create for the show?
Yeah, so like Leigh said, I think my first experience of the piece was about 1.5 years ago. It was at an early workshop for the piece. I think it was only Act 1. And I remember being in this, little rehearsal studio filled with people. And I remember so vividly this image that made me want to kind of leap out of my seat at the end. It was like this row of 25 women, right? So casting wise, the performers are all women, and they were just standing there. And it just felt like formidable. I just was like, this wall of women was so moving to me to see. And I just was like, I definitely need to see this on stage. So, like Shaina said, I think a lot of us have this like history tinged image that comes to mind when you think of the word suffrage. And I too, like, the depth of my knowledge was not very extensive. Like I had this image of, like the white dresses and whatnot. And, but when I started digging through the historical material, and then certainly now in the past few months, like the imagery of protest is so resonant with what's happening today. And so certainly, starting with seeing the row of performers and them like fully embodied as those people, like the performers who are living in the moment today, conflated with the characters, from the story, which, as Shaina said, is so dramatic and crazy. Like I never knew all of that stuff either. So that's kind of what I want to do with the space as well, is to conflate this historical architecture with the present moment. So, as I was doing research, one of the images that leapt out at me was there's this image of a tableau, of a pageant that's happening on the steps of the Treasury building during the big march in 1913. It was just like all these women dotted on the steps of a government building. And it felt like both kind of abstract in a way, but also kind of right that there was this looming structure of patriarchy that they were, walking about on. And like, I felt like at the same time, it's about the people, right? Like starting with that image of the row of women, the set should really serve to be a container that lifts them up and kind of creates volumes of space around them. But the focus really, I think the focus should really be on the people, and the set should just kind of deliver them to the audience in interesting ways. But at the same time, I felt like it was important to put the very thing that they're struggling against on stage, so that you really sense that struggle.
That's so powerful. I mean, I think that one of the things that really comes across, and I'm so excited for people to hear these songs tonight, is, Shaina, you said these are young women, and a lot of them, I mean, there's intergenerational sort of conflict as well. And we recently wrote a book at the Times about some of the lesser well-known figures from the suffrage movement, some of whom also appear in your beautiful musical. So I'm curious about, who are the characters that jumped out to you? Who did you really want to bring to life? And how did you represent them in this musical?
Well, for me, it sort of started from this place of how to pick what the central conflict was going to be, and it's sort of in who to populate within that conflict. And it sort of felt like, maybe the obvious conflict would be to do the group of suffragists versus the anti-suffragists ranging from the politicians and the press and the public and the anti-suffrage women and all the, the forces against them in the political and social machine. But that I sort of felt to kind of have those be the two worlds or the two sides, if you will, felt a little like obvious, like we might be ahead of it. I didn't want this to feel like we were patting ourselves on the back and we're on the right side of history or whatever. And I was more interested, what really jumped out at me was the conflicts internally within the movement, within a group of people who share a common goal in theory, but have completely wildly different notions of how to get there. There's Alice Paul, who's a young radical who thinks we need to disrupt, we need to confront, we need to put pressure singularly on the president, we need to storm the gates of the White House. There's Carrie Chapman Catt, who's in an older generation, is like, you have to seduce and play the game of the inside game politically, and every manner in between. So just that conflict jumped out at me immediately, just those two and the way that they sort of manifest what is not always along generational lines, but you often can see among generational lines this conflict of the older moderate camp and sort of the younger radicals, and how that cycle in the suffrage movement is sort of feels like mothers and daughters. Mm-hmm. As a daughter, you're like, oh, my mom doesn't get me, but then you grow up and you're like, oh, I see my mom had a point, and how those generations of activists. Carrie Catt was the young radical when Susan B. Anthony was around, and then when Alice, a lot of people don't realize, like, lived until the 1970s to see second wave feminism come around, and she was sort of the old fogey to those young radicals, and that cycle goes over again and again. So that's central, but then also, I was really thrilled by all the subgroups of like squads, if you will. Like, I love sort of Alice and her committee with Inez Mulholland and being sort of the face of the movement, and Doris Stevens being the young, eager student, writing about it all and writing it down, and Rosalind Klauska, the fiery Polish immigrant who was trying to, really always push Alice, hold her feet to the fire to include working class women in the movement, which she didn't always successfully do, and Lucy Burns, who was sort of her right-hand friend, best friend, tried and true the whole time, but someone who maybe, in the way I see her, might not have been involved in activism if it hadn't been for being sort of under the spell of Alice's friendship. And then, of course, I loved how, Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Carroll have their own iteration of this radical versus more moderate conflict within their African American club movement, and how each of these microcosmic conflicts sort of showed up in all different wings and factions of the movement. And my only regret is that I can't, it's how do you compact that into a 2.5-hour evening that still has, is giving dramaturgical weight in a way that you can zero in on one person's story, but still tell the story of a collective. For me, this is not the story about one great woman, one great Joan of Arc who got it done, because of course we know it's anything but. And social movements take a group, and it's harder to coalition build and work together for change, but that's what we have to do. So I was really interested in the group, the collective, like Mimi was saying, the 25 women in the picket line who all have a different point of view, but all share the goal, and how do you get things done?
Yeah, I mean, I think the minute you dive into suffrage history, having known so little in school for so much of us, you start to realize it's 3 generations of women. And it's their mothers and daughters and then mothers again. And the fact that only one woman who was at Seneca Falls lived to see the 19th Amendment pass, it just blows your mind. You just realize what it took to keep the movement going for decades. It's so powerful. I always feel like once you dive into it, there are so many women to be passionate about. You mentioned Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells. Leigh and Mimi, are there individual stories or suffragists that you felt like just wouldn't leave you, that these characters have become so dear to you?
Oh, wow. I mean, these women telling their stories and lifting up their struggles and their failures as much as their successes. I mean, right now we're in the process of celebrating the win of 1920, but we also know that it was not a win for everybody. And I think that there is, as you look through suffrage history, I feel like certainly the characters that Shaina talked about in our show, I have to say one of the characters that I feel the closest to is Doris Stevens, because of the book, because of Jailed for Freedom. And one of the struggles that Shaina and I are talking about all the time is, who was Alice Paul? She did not leave much record of herself. She, in fact, I think, endeavored to erase herself from the story. She wanted to have, in a way, no persona inside of the movement. The thing that she was focused on was the movement, was the cause. And in a way, she's left us quite a challenge, and Shaina a challenge in playing her ultimately. But I think that I'm the most intrigued by Alice, and I would say the closest to Doris.
So interesting. Mimi, do you have a moment or a character that really has stayed with you from the show?
Well, I have one image that has, again, like resonated with an image that came up just a couple of months ago. So Inez Milholland was a character a person who I knew nothing about it, actually. And the way that Shaina's dramatized her, and like her persona is just so larger than life. And so I was very captivated by that. And I have been struck by, so there's this image of her riding the horse in the march. And just a couple of months ago, you know, I see in the papers this picture of a woman in Oakland riding a horse. I think her name is Brianna Noble, you know, and it was like, wow, that's so interesting. Like the same impulse to, you know, kind of get on a horse and ride into the crowds because it's kind of an inescapable image. Like for me, started to do this thing of conflating the past and the present, and how the impulse, you know, sort of remains, that same impulse to protest. So that's something that's been sticking with me.
That's so powerful. I mean, the suffragists definitely loved pageantry, and they had so much flair, you know. The audience has a lot of questions, and we don't have a lot of time for questions, but Emily asked, can you all talk about the term suffragist versus suffragette and the importance of language in the musical?
Yes, I'm so glad you're asking that, Emily. So from what I understand, you know, the word most of us know is suffragette, right? And to me, that's no accident, because that's sort of the diminutive, misogynistic, diminishing term that the press and the detractors of the movement would use to sort of, oh, how cute, oh, the suffragettes, oh, those little suffragettes, you know, and they would use it as a way to disempower suffragists, at least in America. The British movement is a whole nother thing, so we'll do another panel about that. But like, but then suffragist is what they call themselves. You know, if you look at any primary source, a suffragist that's the word that they were using. So in the but then also there, you could see them sometimes reclaim the word suffragette. It's the same way we see today, like a nasty woman shirt, you know, like oh, well, you're going to call me suffragette? Only I can, you know, like I'm a suffragette. So you really toggle between the two. So the show, you know, right now is called Suffragist. I think just in an effort to clarify that right up top. But our opening number is called Watch Out for the Suffragette, because I was so struck in like figuring out the music for the show. I uncovered there's a whole songbook from 1910s vaudeville that are these anti-suffrage, misogynist, gleeful songs about like, yeesh, watch out for those suffragettes, they'll get you, those ugly old crazy spinsters, whoo, you don't want to be around them, you know. And I just loved it. It was wild to me, like political satire was alive and well, and I thought it'd be fun, you know. In our show, I've sort of taken my own spin, writing a few of those songs, and so our show begins with the whole cast dressed as men saying, get out while you can, folks. These suffragettes are going to be a real drag.
Wow.
But then, yeah, so I've had fun playing with the combo of those two terms, and hopefully clarifying the video.
Wow, it's so amazing how you found like creative push and pull between them, because it is so complicated in the history. And so speaking of songs, we're now going to share with you the first of two never heard before songs from Suffragist, Wait My Turn, sung by Tony Award winner Nikki M. James, who plays Ida B. Wells Barnett, the journalist and activist. And Shaina, can you set this song up for us? What's the concept?
So our story in Act 1 really kicks off when the protagonist, Alice Paul, arrives in Washington, D.C. to organize this unprecedented idea for an event that she dreamed up of a procession of women demanding a federal suffrage amendment down Pennsylvania Avenue in the Capitol, and for this to be held the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. And so she hits the ground running, and she assembles her squad, her team, and in a whirlwind 2 months, they organize frantically, furiously this massive event And as the day comes closer and closer, women from all over the country are set to attend. It's really thrilling. And, you know, initially the invitation to participate was supposedly open to everyone. And several distinguished Black women are planning to attend. There's Mary Church Terrell, there's the Delta Sigma Theta sorority from Howard University, and there's Ida B. Wells, as you said, the renowned Black activist, journalist, speaker who's planning to come in from Chicago to represent and march, representing her own newly formed organization, the Alpha Suffrage Club. But then Alice and her crew start to receive backlash and criticism from Southern women who are threatening not to participate if Black women are involved. And Alice is so single-minded, so obsessed with blinders on about getting this federal amendment passed, and so afraid of anything that in her mind gets in the way of that, that she makes a racist decision to ask the Black women to march in back of the parade instead of there with the respective state delegations like everyone else. And so in the show, I've imagined an encounter, a moment where the night before the march, Ida Wells arrives in town. She gets off probably with a very long train from Chicago and shows up at Alice and her committee's office and confronts them about this. And I imagine Alice saying something like, oh, Mrs. Wells, we're on your side, but we don't have a choice here without the Southern women's support. There will be no march. I think we all must do whatever it takes for the march to go forward because women have had to wait our turn long enough, she says. And Ida responds in this song.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Wait my turn. When will you white women ever learn? I had the same damn talk with Susan B. Anthony 20 years ago. I thought you might be better, but you still don't know. Do you not realize you're not free until I'm free? Or do you refuse to see? Well, it's not my job to teach you, but it seems to have fallen to me. You say I must wait my turn, but I sure don't see you waiting yours. No, you're preaching, we demand it now, while knocking down locked doors. But you want me to wait my turn, so you don't offend your Southern base. Since when does a radical roll over for bigots in the first place? That's not leadership, Alice, that's cowardice. I heard you quote Frederick Douglass on your soapbox, intending to include and impress us. But in the press, you play down our involvement, and here behind closed doors, you attempt to suppress us. Deeds, not words, says the button on your jacket. I'm so sick of rhetoric with no action to back it. If you don't have the spine to stand for us now, what will it take? You do have a choice, there's always a choice. Which one will you make? Don't you dare tell me to wait my turn. In truth, it's not your call. Either I march with my own state's delegates, or I don't march at all. I'm not here to soothe your guilt. That's none of my concern. I won't beg for your approval, which I shouldn't have to earn. So no matter what you tell me, I will not wait one more minute for my turn.
Hi, welcome back. I'm Michael Paulson. I'm the theater reporter for the New York Times, and I'm joined by members of the cast. Joining us momentarily will be Nikki James, who sang the song you all just watched. She's playing Ida B. Wells, and you might know her from her Tony-winning performance in The Book of Mormon. You've already met Shaina Taub, who, it turns out, not only wrote this show, but is starring in it as Alice Paul. Jenn Colella, hi Jen. Jen is playing Carrie Chapman Catt, and she was nominated for a Tony Award for Come From Away. And Kuhoo Verma is here. She's playing Doris Stevens, and she recently appeared in the acclaimed off-Broadway musical Octet. So Nikki, let's start with you. We know Ida B. Wells best for her work as a journalist who won a lot of praise for her coverage of lynching. Can you talk a little about how she fits into the story of suffrage and why her inclusion is important for this show?
Yeah, so I think, sorry, I know it was my own performance, but I feel emotional mostly because I'm so proud of this show and it feels really amazing to be sharing it with people for the first time and to see my beautiful castmates. So I'm just going to collect myself. But Ida is this incredibly fierce woman, and the thing I love most about her is that she is not fighting for one thing. Ida is fighting for women's suffrage and civil rights simultaneously. And because her attention is necessarily divided, a lot of the Black women who are fighting fiercely for suffrage at this time are not often included in the history because some of the other work that they were doing at the time, especially Ida, as Shaina writes in the show, her unflinching recounting of lynchings in the South. That is such a huge part of her story. But simultaneously, she was fighting for her own individual rights, as were many Black women in our country. And what I love that Shaina's doing here is that she is just allowing for the complications in any of these movements. It's something she said earlier, where we all want the same thing, but we may have different values and we may have different sort of ideas about how to get around it. And Alice is our heroine, but she is not exclusively a hero. I love that Shaina is allowing for the faults of people can do good things and also have made some bad decisions. There's no sugarcoating. And I think it's really important to humanize the women, the Black women in our show, Ida B. Wells. We focus on Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell. It's really incredible and complex, and the moments when she appears, Ida, who is not involved on the day-to-day of what Alice Paul and the NWP women were doing, whenever she shows up, it's a really beautiful, powerful moment, and I'm really grateful that Shaina allowed room for that in this story.
Jen, I want to ask you a little about the challenge of playing real people, because we've just come off a run playing a pioneering woman pilot. In that case, the real person was alive and you got to know her. In this case, you're playing a historical figure. Are you doing research? Or are you inventing something out of a script? Or how do you go about interpreting somebody who was a real person for the stage?
Well, the benefit as an actor playing iconic women in American history, and I think both of these women is that I have the distinct honor to share their stories and their ideas that will continue to influence the lives of many. So that is a deep honor. It was easier with Captain Bass because I got to have coffee with Captain Bass. I know how she holds her coffee cup. I know what her eyebrows do when she has a secret about someone. I can use all of this information as an actor to develop, how I'm going to portray her. I have read a lot of essays and a lot of books that Carrie has written and that have been written about Carrie Chapman Catt, but it's hard because I only have a couple of videos, some grainy videos and a few audios of her voice. So I have to trust the knowledge that I'm gaining through these essays and these books and through what Shaina's writing and what I can bring to the character myself as an actress.
Kuhoo, I want to ask you about the moment in which we're now living. This show is being developed at a tumultuous time in America when there's a lot of concern about democracy and about equity. And I wonder how you think that climate affects your thinking about the show and the show itself.
Sure. I have been thinking about this show so much during these times because, yeah, like Nikki said, it's a very complicated and delicious show where every moment is so full of information. And I think that it feels very, very of the time right now. It's like there are 7 sides of everything. And we have to take the time and consideration to try to understand all of those things before forming how we personally relate to what's going on. And I mean, I am very biased, but as someone who is playing Doris Stevens, you know, we are also towing this line of like, how much does art play into activism and vice versa? And for Doris to have a written account of all of these women's lives and their stories together, it becomes like short story, like the short version is like, no, art by itself is not activism, but like long answer, yes. To have an account and to have that kind of history written out is so powerful and so needed, and it has given such a gift that keeps on giving with this show and with all the other suffragist musicals and accounts being written right now. And so I think like this show is like a daily reminder for myself that when people do get to see this, it's just going to be history that begets history that begets history.
Shaina, I want to ask you a question about musical theater writing that comes from one of our viewers, Astrid. She notes that you're writing the book and the lyrics and the music, and asks, do you ever find yourself in an argument with yourself about priorities? What comes first, like the scenes or the music or the lyrics?
That's a great question, Astrid. I mean, yes, I do argue with myself, and it's a, as I love Kuhoo's word, delicious challenge to try and put it all together. With this, since it's the first project I've taken on that's historical, I really dove in and obsessed with the research for a long time. And I think that's an obsession that's still hard to shake. And making long outlines of all the just amazing factoids and anecdotes I found. And usually each, you know, the show is all sung through because I just felt like the sense of a social movement, it never stops moving. It's got to have that tempo and that drive. So there's a lot of long sequences, and usually, you know, I'll write that out in a big, huge, long sketch for it. I'm just cutting down. But the challenge has been for my lyricist self and my composer self and bringing out the emotion to humanize these women. All the research and books in the world that I look at are not going to tell me what Alice was thinking at 3 a.m. pacing around her office, what she was thinking in her 5th night of a hunger strike and solitary confinement, aren't going to tell me the, you know, the hurt and pain and love in the years-long friendship between Alice and Lucy and all the things left unsaid. So that emotional meat that really makes a song soar, that is when sometimes I have to tell the book writer, you know, architect self, like, chill out, worry about the dramaturgy later. Like, what does she feel? Like, put the notes away, close the research, and really try and have it come from the heart.
I want to ask all of you, obviously, musical development is complicated under the best of circumstances, but this is a pretty unusual circumstance. We're in the middle of a pandemic. You can't meet together. This technology that we're using right now, Zoom, is not particularly good at choral singing, at ensemble singing. How do you continue to work on a show at a moment like this? Anybody?
We had a reading actually right when we began our quarantine. It was just a couple of weeks into quarantine, and it was frustrating on a technical level because we're not technicians and we had to do our own play buttons and, you know, speakers and that sort of thing. But we also found it incredibly moving. Just like the Suffragist, we found a way to make it happen. There was an obstacle and we were like, nope, we're going to do this. And so it really galvanized our desire to continue this work because we won't be stopped, and theater will come back. It always comes back historically, and think of the gratitude that we will all feel being audience members and on stage when it does.
That is so well said, Jen for president. But I also, there's, you know, I want to acknowledge that with all of the pivoting and improvising we're doing, and I don't want to speak for everyone, but I know that this sentiment is passed around. We have a group chat and we periodically Zoom with each other. We were so hungry and excited to share this musical surrounding the centennial of the passage of the suffrage amendment. It felt right. And now it's obviously not going to be right. So there's a sadness for us to be away from each other, to be distant from each other. We are a collection of women who've become so close to each other, to this work, to the women that we are bringing to life.
And it's a very, I've had a long and beautiful professional career, and this is a singular experience. So the anxiety and the anxiousness to really get this on stage in front of people is there. And then simultaneously, this show is about history, and we are living through that right now. And as artists, we are being forced to take a pause and to slow down. And I really do believe, because I think Shaina is a genius, that this show will have parts of this experience put into it that will make it that much better. I don't know, that's no pressure. You don't have to write Lear, Shaina. I'm just saying, we're artists, we're sponges. It will be in there. This time will be in there. And we are actually, in a way, kind of living through some of the frustration that the suffragists had. They fought for a long time too to have their day when the paper was signed, and we will be together stronger at the end of this when we come back. But there's some sadness there.
Abby asks, what is a little known fun fact that you would share about one of your favorite suffragists?
Who wants to take it? I mean, there's
Shaina, yeah, anybody, go ahead.
Go, Shaina, go.
Okay, sorry. I mean, I love, so you may think all the characters are women. Not true. You know, Grace McLean plays President Woodrow Wilson. And then one of my favorite discoveries was Dudley Field Malone. Now, he was this guy who worked in the Wilson administration as the collector of the Port of New York. I always forget what his official title was, but like I just think of him as sort of like chief of staff, whatever. And he worked for Wilson and was this like devout Wilton disciple. But then I noticed in the research that in 1917 he wrote this open letter publicly. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Get publicly resigning from the Wilson administration in the newspaper. And he said, I've served you for all these years, but I think it's high time that men of this generation, at some cost to themselves, stand up in support of the women of this country. And in Doris's book, I noticed that she was like, oh, Dudley Malone did this wonderful, amazing thing for women, and he's such a hero. And I'm like, she's really going on about this Dudley guy, okay. And then I noticed in a footnote, and now, I mean, historians, this must be your bread and butter, but as a songwriter, the fun of footnotes and kind of following the trail of bibliographies, it's a real thrill. But anyway, I noticed in a footnote, you know, Dudley Malone and Doris Stevens get married in 1921. And I was like, there's a love story, you know, and, you know, there are other love stories too. You know, we get Carrie Chapman Catt and her life partner, Molly Hay. But I was just, in addition, thrilled to find Dudley and Doris, and that it was this sort of classic musical theater thing of, you know, a secondary pair of lovers that were taking on, you know, one of the main themes of the show. And just the fact that, you know, Doris enlightened him to equality, and that he did resign the Wilson administration and join the suffragists as their pro bono lawyer. And it was really important to me that, you know, I will say, like, that the good men feel seen by the show as well, and that we need good male allies. And I was just so thrilled to find Dudley as that character.
And she did such a good job of separating. She wasn't like, so Dudley, my boyfriend. She was very like, this is happening, he works for Wilson, and then this happened, and you don't even know until later.
She was burying the lead.
She gave it away.
My favorite, and you'll remind me, Shaina, the name of the state senator when they were passing the last state, Tennessee.
Oh,
right?
Harry Byrne?
Yeah, and they were worried about the suffragists this was their last stand, this was the last state, and they were maybe a vote or two shy of passing. And this one young guy, and this is true, I mean, the story is so musicalized, I can't believe that we're the first, but he got a letter from his mother on the day of the vote, which had been postponed a few days. Like, they kept on sort of like doing other business. I think it went on for like a couple of days, and he got a letter from his mother, and buried somewhere in there, you know, his mother said something like, you should do something nice for whoever, I can't remember. And he voted in a surprise, like to everyone's shock, that he voted to pass the amendment. And I love that this guy's mom was able to get under his skin.
Totally.
Just subtly. And Shaina writes this beautiful song where the mother sings a beautiful song reading the letter, and it's in the second act, towards the end of the second act, and it's there are a handful of songs that I absolutely cannot get through without crying, and that is one of them. But I don't know, I'm weepy, so.
So you've alluded to this already, but Nadia asks, and I don't know if you fully addressed it, Nadia asks, does the show address which women get the right to vote in the 19th Amendment and which do not?
Yes, so a big theme of our show, you know, the finale is called The Work Is Never Over. And it was really important to me and to all of us to not end the show with some simple sense of victory in 1920, because we all know it was anything but. That, yes, on paper, women may have won the right to vote in 1920, but we all know it was decades longer until women of color had access to that right, and Native women and Chinese American women and so many more. And so, yes, actually, you know, spoiler alert, although it's history, so there's no spoiler alerts, we jump ahead to the 70s where Alice is much older. And, you know, the show begins with Carrie being confronted by the young Alice saying, no, you're doing it wrong, you've got to do it this way. And the show ends with sort of a mirror moment with Alice and a second wave young feminist of color really calling her out on all the mistakes and short-sightedness, and acknowledging in that moment, which is in the early 70s, of how, you know, there's still so much voter suppression, and that it was not, the 19th Amendment didn't actually win everyone access to the right to vote. So yes, we absolutely acknowledge that, and it to me was always about finding that complicated finale that is, you know, the suffragist mantra early on was finish the fight, which is, you know, Alice's song in Act 1, finish the fight, and failure is impossible, and all these very definitive, like, we're gonna finish this. But what Alice, you know, doesn't learn till later in life, and what I think we all have to learn as activists, is that work is never over, the fight is never finished, and failure is often more inevitable than it is impossible, but still we have to fight anyway. You know, in front, the quote I sort of put on the front of the script is a quote from the Talmud, which is, you are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And that was really a guiding principle for me with this, and that I hope people, you know, there's sort of a moment at the end where we point to the next generation, and my hope is that people take that away and understand that this work, and the work to be an equal citizen, enfranchised citizen in this country, and the work to pressure our leaders to have America live up to the promises of the experiment that they started for justice and equality, that work is never done.
So we're here, this show is part of a series looking at theater making during this pandemic and theater artists during this pandemic. I wonder if you all could reflect on what is going on with the theater community now, and what your sense is of how people are surviving financially and creatively. What is the impact on people whose lives are theater on this sustained period when people can't be on stage?
Well, it's no surprise that financially we're struggling, because we have a 100% unemployment in our business. But what's interesting about that is that we still don't stop. There are still things being created. There are new things being written. We're constantly working on things. We're helping each other with projects. Actors are used to down periods. It's part of what we're made to face. When we agree to do this thing, we know it's not going to be just, oh, once you hit it, that's it, and you're going to make a bunch of money and you've made it big. It's not that. It's ups and downs, and we're built for this. So while it's difficult and scary, and we don't know when theater will come back, or how we'll be able to make a living again doing it, it hasn't dampened, from what I've seen, the spirits of most artists. We're still creating, we're still writing, and we're very much leaning on one another to look out for our emotional needs as well. It's quite beautiful.
I also kind of find it fascinating what kind of content people are creating when there's no pressure of instant monetization in any way. What kind of different content and where people's minds are going in that kind of a space. It feels like a nice white blank space to work from.
Yeah, the pressure is off in a way. There's a bit of freedom, and in the restriction, I think artists are really finding themselves to be deeply creative. For me, outside of this incredible suffragist family, in the recent months, I've joined this sort of new bizarre coalition, a collection of artists, performing artists, and other designers and stuff with my dear friend Michael Arden, and we embarked on this very strange endeavor to make what we hope can be a model for socially distant outdoor theater in cars and out of cars. And we embarked on it just like this, not unlike this, a group of people on Zoom twice a week, just talking about our feelings and our ideas and saying, like, if we could get together, what would we maybe do? And what technology can we reach out to? And it's been absolutely feeding my artistic soul. And also it's been a huge reminder of what it used to feel like when you just did this because you couldn't imagine doing anything else. And like Kuhoo said, being freed of how much does it pay and all of those things, which, you know, that is important too. We all still need to eat and keep roofs over our heads. But when you don't have to make a choice about what it looks like for your career, because that's not an option. When you can just say, today I feel like singing this song, collaborating with this human, it's pretty amazing. And it's been salve, absolutely, to continue to find community, trying to anyway.
Shaina, let me ask you about the sound of the show. How do you go about figuring out a musical style for something that is set in the early 20th century? Do you embrace like a contemporary vocabulary or a historical one or some kind of mix? What was your thinking?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that. I mean, I was talking a little bit about earlier that idea of this was early Broadway, Tin Pan Alley, early jazz, and all these sort of vaudeville style numbers, and also marches and marching bands. And I found myself much more in love with those styles than I thought when I set out. And I think there's something so powerful and evocative about including them. So I've tried to kind of take this musical thesis of the sound of the time and really putting us in that era and helping us understand that this was 100 years ago and what America was like in that era, but then also, and so play on all the idioms of the time, but then also figure out what the sound is of the future the suffragists were trying to create. And with that, the challenges, and I've tried not to impose an idiomatic genre choice on the sound of that future of like, you know, it's the 1910s and then they're singing Riot Grrrl Pop. Like it's not that much of that. So I've tried to like just let that soul impulse, heart and soul impulse lead of trying to figure out what that sound is and then have those two things rub up against each other. Yeah, so that's sort of been the dichotomy I'm playing with.
And let me also, sticking with you for a moment, ask you, you had written this musical, now here we are in this moment of both pandemic and this kind of national conversation about racial inequality. Are you making changes to the show? Does it make you think differently about what you're doing? How does this moment affect what you had already put on the page?
I think it just strengthens my resolve to tell this history. You know, there's a quote I love by a Native American activist who her name was Paula Gunn Allen, and she said the root of oppression is the loss of memory. And that really drives me at the sense of like why we need to tell these stories, because we need to know, not only do we need to learn from the mistakes and the failures, as we've been saying throughout, but we need to know that change is possible and that we have been victorious before. And sometimes, you know, when I get down and people are like, oh, well, can you believe when you're studying the suffrage movement so little has changed? And like, yes, in some way we still have so much farther to go in the fight for equality, both gender equality and racial justice and the intersections of both in this country. But the suffragists were able to change the United States Constitution at a time where the idea of enfranchising half the American population was a laughingstock. And they did it without Twitter, they did it without the internet, they did it at this time where they could barely travel to another state, you know? And so I'm inspired by that. I'm like, if they could do this, and now my life 100 years later is probably beyond their wildest notion of the freedoms that a woman could have, we can absolutely do it too. So I think it's just, this story reinvigorates my sense of hope in watching the action in the streets and the way that so many of the tactics that they pioneered and then were continued in all the voting rights struggles throughout the past century are just alive and well.
Another viewer asks the cast, what books or resources were most useful in gaining insight into suffrage and or the historical figures that you've been asked to play?
I want to say Jailed for Freedom, again, for the Dora Stevens book. And then The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss is another big one. Carrie Chapman Catt, A Public Life by Jacqueline von Boris is a big one. And then Women's Suffrage and Politics, The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement, which was written by Carrie Catt, is also a good one.
Oh, plug. I mean, we have Shaina. Clearly, I just text her. Okay, can you? I mean, she's like become an encyclopedia on this. But Jailed for Freedom, obviously, which is our source material, and Ida did a lot of her own writing and publications, which are easy to find. And I've been reading a little bit, studying about her voice and her sort of cadence and her fight. She's deeply impressive.
And the add second to all those. Oh, I'm sorry, Kuhoo, go ahead.
I was going to echo like yes to all. And also, if you want to look up on Twitter, the Daily Suffragist, it is such a helpful, it's such a helpful little factoid account. It's amazing. Check it out.
It is, and to add and second echo all of that, and also I found, Paula Giddings has a phenomenal biography of Ida B. Wells. The scholarship of Rosalind Terborg Penn has been really instrumental in helping me understand the African American women's role in this movement, and her scholarship has been very valuable.
So before we transition to the next song, I want to ask you all a little about what you sort of see in your crystal balls. We have no idea when theater's going to return, and I wonder, what are your attitudes about returning to work? Are you eager to get back on stage, or does the thought of it make you nervous? And in what ways do you think theater might be different when it does come back? Who wants to start? Jen?
We're stoked to come back. We can't wait to come back. You can't hold us back. Put us back in the game, coach. Yeah, it's going to be extraordinary. Again, for audience members and actors, we can't wait to come back. Yes, we'll be a little nervous, and I hope that it is different. I pray that it's different. There's going to be different stories. There's going to be different voices. And it's thrilling. It's going to be a whole new world. And, the theater means the seeing place. It's where we go to see ourselves and to learn about ourselves. And we are going to have so much to share after this. So I cannot wait.
Same. I mean, I think I've never been more in love with the theater of being told that I can't go to it. I mean, the only thing I love more than being in theater is seeing theater. I am almost more anxious to be a person, to be taken on a journey, to get a glimpse into the mind of someone like Shaina Taub, someone whose passion for storytelling, whose passion and love of humanity and nuance is being presented to me. I'm excited to be challenged in the way that theater challenges you to lean forward. Theater as an audience member is something that asks you to meet it halfway. In order to have the experience, it does not wash, it requires you to join. I long for the day when it is safe enough to stand in the back of the theater and to watch 900 strangers lean forward at the same moment. And I know that we will get there. I know that it is necessary. We are not essential workers in the sense that we are not people who are needed in this moment to keep our nation moving forward and to get people healthy. But I think we are essential to the soul. And I know that now even more than ever, having been asked to stay away. So cannot wait, but when it is safe. And in the meantime, we'll keep doing things like this, and we'll keep our journals so that we have great, great stories to tell you when the time comes.
I'm super excited for what this new theater is going to look like. There's been so much interrogation and introspection on the kind of practices that happen in these rooms, the kind of practices that happen with casting, and also especially these young kids in college right now, really interrogating what predominantly white institutions are doing in fostering an all-white theater and what they can do to change from like the roots up what theater looks like. And so I'm so excited to see the slow but like sure change that's going on in theater right now.
Shaina, you want to add anything?
Amen to all of that. Absolutely. I just think we're going to come back stronger than ever. And I keep focusing on that first moment, that first applause moment in our first show back, what that, just how sweet that will feel and how much we need it. We've got to gather. We've got to gather. It's just the human impulse. It's the human nature. And I know we've all made it through tough things before, and we'll be back.
Just hoping. I'm eager for it too. I miss theater and I miss seeing all of you on stage. But we are gonna get a chance to see you all sing. But before we do, I want to thank you all for being here, as well as the creative team that was here earlier. And to our audience, I want to thank you as well. We hope you're going to come back on August 18th for Finish the Fight, about unsung heroes of the suffrage movement. You can RSVP for that event, which is also free, and others by visiting timesevents.nytimes.com. And now please enjoy How Long, which is performed by the Company of Suffragists and will be introduced by Shaina.
The song that we're singing tonight takes place at a funeral for a suffragist named Inez Milholland. She was a labor lawyer and a renowned public speaker. In 1916, Inez was on the trail campaigning against President Woodrow Wilson's re-election, leading rally after rally in city after city for months on end. She was in the middle of giving a speech in LA, leading a crowd in a chant of "How long must women wait for liberty? How long must women wait for liberty?" when she collapsed of exhaustion at the podium. She was rushed to a hospital and died shortly after. She was only 30 years old. In this song, the fractured movement comes together to mourn Inez and to figure out how to transform their grief and rage into action.
She was enchanting, magnetic,
Unapologetic.
it was almost annoying how easily she seemed to shine. You could hide nothing from her, she read you like a book.
She'd have been wrecked by the results of this election, but she'd have poured us a drink and reminded us not to lose hope.
She knew her smile was all that it took.
The last thing she said was the question we're now asking over and over as we look back.
As we look forward,
How long must women wait for liberty? How long must we wait? Must we wait? Must we wait?
she went into trial, a laugh on her lips.
She once told me discouragement only excited her. So brilliant a speaker, we can't afford to lose.
She belongs to life.
To the struggling actuality of the earth.
I used to wish
I could be in her shoes, with her voice ringing out. The centuries seemed like repetitions, but an ancient song singing how long must women wait for liberty? How long must we wait? Must we wait? Must we wait? How many more marches in the streets? How many more efforts gone to waste? How many more deafening defeats? How many more histories erased? How many more
dignities defer.
How many
more told to know our place?
How many more
girls will go unheard?
How many more doors shut in our face? How many more drones burned at the stake? How many more of us will it take? How long? How long? Till it's too late, will we We won't wait another day. We won't wait another day. We won't wait another day. We won't wait. We won't wait. We won't. We won't wait another day. We won't wait another day. We won't wait another day. We won't wait. We won't wait. We won't. We won't wait. We won't wait.